Hello, I'm Chris Anderson, and I'll be your teacher today. To start the lesson, I'd like you to think of a time when you were at school. Maybe you still are at school. What were or are the rules? Do you follow them? Now I'd like you to think of a place where somebody pays to go. For example, a private language school or a gym. What are the rules in these places? How do they affect the people who go to these places? In today's lesson, we're going to look at a grammar point that will help you to accurately describe rules, specifically the rules we give ourselves and the rules that come from the outside, from people or institutions. So, if we go back to the idea of a private language school, let's imagine there's a student who's not doing very well. He might say to himself, how can I get better? Well, one thing he could do is do more homework. So it's his responsibility to do more homework, and he has decided that this is true. On the other hand, when it's time for this student to pay, of course it's his responsibility to pay, but who tells him it's time to pay? The school tells him. From the outside, they tell him it's his responsibility to pay. Now, when we're describing these situations, internal and external rules, this is the kind of grammar that we use. And first, we're going to look at the rules that come from the outside. And to do this, we use have to or has to. Now, the form of these sentences looks like this. Subject. In the negative, we use don't and doesn't, which we'll talk about in a minute, because the negative form is not actually the opposite of have to. We use have or has in the third person with to and then a bare infinitive. For example, you have to pay the school fees. Today is the last day. So somebody is not telling themselves this. In fact, the school are probably telling a student, it's your responsibility. You have to pay. We make the rules. You need to follow the rules. He has to return the keys to the hotel reception desk. So again, this isn't something you would probably say to yourself. This is somebody being told from the outside the rules, the obligations that they need to follow. Now, when we look at don't have to, it's like I said, it's not an opposite of have to. So here, for example, we've got you don't have to worry about it. Everything is okay now. So in the way that we use have to describe an obligation or rules or responsibilities that you have to follow from the outside, don't have to describes a situation where there is no obligation. In this case, the person doesn't have to worry because externally a responsibility has been met by somebody else or another person. Teachers don't have to wear a tie if they don't want to. Now again, they have a choice. There's no obligation. The teachers won't get into trouble if they don't wear a tie. They can wear a tie, but in general, the rule is that there is no rule. You don't have to wear a tie. Now, when we're talking about internal responsibility, rules that we give ourselves, or rules that we are describing to somebody, as in we are saying it is your responsibility to do this, we use must. For example, I must do more homework. So again, the form here, subject with must or mustn't, plus bare infinitive. So again, I must do more homework, or I will fail this course. A teacher isn't saying this, the school rules aren't saying this, but the student has decided themselves. It's my responsibility, my obligation to do more homework, to get better. We must start the lesson on time, as in it is our responsibility. Probably in this situation, it's teachers talking to students. Come on guys, it's our responsibility from the inside, there's no external rules here. We must start the lesson on time. They mustn't be late. So mustn't, again, it's a bit closer to the opposite of must, but actually it's very strong. You mustn't be late or there will be a big, big problem. You mustn't do that. And again, this is somebody telling somebody else they have a strong responsibility to themselves about something that they should not do. But it's not shouldn't, it's much, much stronger than that. So the thing to remember with mustn't is it's a very, very strong obligation not to do something. Now, you might have noticed that sometimes there isn't a big difference between have to and must. For example, feeding a baby. I have to feed the baby or I must feed the baby. Well, societies in general say you have to feed the baby, but you as a parent would say to yourself, well, I must feed the baby. And to be honest, sometimes there isn't a big difference. In general, with speaking, we would use have to, but I think the rules of internal and external obligation should be followed pretty closely. So far we've looked at stronger obligations, as in internally, as in saying to yourself, I must do this or I mustn't do this. But also we've looked at how from outside sources we receive rules. You have to pay, for example. Now, if we want to talk about obligations in a slightly weaker way, that is to say, the person has more of a choice whether they do this thing or not, we use should. Should is often used for advice, but we can also use should in terms of saying whether or not something is a good or bad idea. For example, you should see this film. It's great. Strong recommendation. Now, maybe this person will or won't see the film. The form of should or shouldn't sentences looks like this. Subject plus should or shouldn't plus bare infinitive. So again, more examples. She should bring cakes for her colleagues. Now, that doesn't mean she has to. So there's a chance she might not. But she has a choice. We are saying it would be a good idea if she did bring cakes. She should bring cakes for her colleagues. They shouldn't smoke. It's unhealthy. So here we're giving strong advice about what somebody shouldn't do, as in we're saying it's a bad idea to smoke. You have an obligation to yourself regarding your health, but it's your choice. We shouldn't go to bed so late. So again, we're saying it's a bad idea. We have an obligation to ourselves to be healthy, so we should go to bed earlier. But it's your choice. You can decide. Now, when we use all of these modal verb forms, must, have to, and should, in question forms, obviously, as usual with English, the word order is slightly different. And there are a few other things to remember. For example, it's very, very uncommon to use must in questions. Regardless of whether you're describing internal or external obligation, we use have to. For example, what do we have to take to the party? Well, this is our responsibility, but we're using have to because it's common to use have to in question forms. Should we ask the Queen for permission? A very weird rule in English is the fact that should with we can only be used in very, very formal situations. For example, asking the Queen for permission to do something. Do you think we should visit him? So this is a more common way of using should. It's an informal situation. We wouldn't say, should we visit him? Because like I said, we can only really use should we in formal situations. So instead, we add the do you question form here. Should I open the windows? Well, it's okay to use should with I, he, she, it. And here we're offering, is it a good idea if I open the windows? What should he do to get better at English? What would the good idea be for him to do better at English? And again, we haven't used must, we haven't used used to, so really it's his choice. He has an obligation to himself, but ultimately we're not saying it's a strong obligation. So in today's lesson, we've looked at obligation. We've looked at how we use have to talk about rules that come from the outside that we need to follow. And we've talked about the role of must and how must comes internally. It's our decision or a decision that somebody is asking us to make. Then we looked at should and shouldn't and how should and shouldn't are used to talk about weaker obligation. The speaker or the user has more of a choice in this situation. We've also looked at question forms that use modal verbs of obligation and some of the strange things that we need to remember. For example, don't use must, it's very uncommon, and the fact that should we is a more formal form of using should in questions. So, to check that you've understood this grammar point, you can now do the exercises that follow this lesson. Good luck.